They were told Americans would torture them, starve them, strip them of their dignity. But when Japanese prisoners stepped off the train at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin in 1944, the enemy broke them not with violence, but with hamburgers and Coca-Cola. The moment the train doors opened, a wave of frozen air rushed inside. Dozens of exhausted men stepped down onto the snow-packed ground, blinking into the pale winter light. Their uniforms were torn and mended with rags. Their faces were hollow, their eyes tired, their lips cracked from thirst and hunger. Each man carried the same belief, drilled into him since his first day in the Imperial Army. Capture was shame. Capture was worse than death. They had been told that the Americans were monsters. That surrender meant torture. That the enemy would break their bodies, humiliate their spirits, and erase whatever honor they had left. So when they stepped into American hands, they prepared to meet their end. But what they saw instead made them hesitate. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the snow. Guard towers rose above the wire fences. Sentries watched from their posts, rifles in hand. And yet, there was order here, discipline, even routine. Trucks moved along the roads inside the camp. Smoke curled from chimneys, and through the air drifted something impossible, the smell of food. Rich food, warm food. The men exchanged nervous glances. Could it be real? Was this a trick before the cruelty began? Commands came sharp and quick in English. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. Firm, controlled, not angry. Interpreters stepped in, translating each order with precision. Line up, move forward. Do not break formation. Then they noticed something even stranger. Officials with white armbands and clipboards were standing nearby. The Red Cross. Back home, they had been told America ignored all rules, that Americans were savages, indifferent to law and honor. And yet here were men ensuring the rules were followed. The prisoners didn't know what to think. The processing was mechanical but shocking in its humanity. They were deloused. Their lice-infested uniforms burned. Medical checks performed, fevers measured, bones examined. A soldier with a broken arm waited, expecting to be ignored. Instead, an American medic approached him, removed the old filthy bandage, cleaned the wound, and carefully wrapped it again. The man sat frozen. His mind refused to accept what his eyes saw. This wasn't how enemies behaved. One whispered to another, "Why would they do this? We are not their men." The other replied quietly, "It must be a trick." Wait, the fear never left. Every step felt like it might lead to punishment, but every hour revealed something else, something harder to fear. Rules, structure, fairness. The Geneva Convention, a phrase they had barely believed in, suddenly became real. After registration, they marched through the snow toward the barracks. Their boots crunched against the ice. The wind stung their faces, but inside, the buildings were heated. There were stoves, wool blankets, even bunks with mattresses. It wasn't home, but it wasn't hell either. Some men sat carefully on their beds, pressing their hands into the rough fabric, half expecting it to disappear. It didn't. The camp was strict, but not cruel. They saw guards help prisoners who stumbled. They saw medics tending to the sick. They saw Red Cross inspectors ensuring food was distributed fairly. Nothing about this place made sense. They had been told capture was the end of honor, that to be a prisoner was to become less than human. But inside Camp McCoy, something different began to take shape. The prisoners did not relax. They did not trust. But as night fell and they lay under warm blankets, the confusion began to grow heavier than fear. What if everything they had been taught about the enemy was wrong? For those men, the first night in Camp McCoy was not the end of a war. It was the beginning of doubt. They did not yet know that the moment which would truly shatter them would come not from pain or punishment, but from kindness, because the next morning, when the bugles sounded, and they were marched toward the mess hall, the enemy would break them again, not with weapons, not with words, but with the smell of grilled meat and the fizz of Coca-Cola bottles waiting to be opened. The line moved slowly. Boots scraped against the wooden floor. The air inside the mess hall was warm, filled with smells so rich they felt unreal. For a moment, every man stood frozen. The scent was unmistakable grilled meat, bread, onions, and something sweet and smoky. A smell they had never known before. They were prisoners. They expected rations of thin soup, hard bread, maybe a few scraps of meat. But what they saw when they reached the front of the line stopped them cold. On a long counter sat trays of food, real food. Golden brown hamburger buns, thick patties sizzling with juice, steam rising from freshly boiled vegetables, and beside it all, rows of glass bottles chilled, dark and fizzing. Coca-Cola. The guards handed them out as if this were the most normal thing in the world. A hamburger, a soda, for prisoners of war. At first, no one moved. They looked at the trays, then at each other, waiting for the trick. Was this a test? Would they be punished for touching it? The interpreter said calmly, "Eat." Still, no one dared, until one man, a young private from Osaka, lifted the hamburger and took a bite. The room fell silent. The bread was soft, the meat rich, the flavor overwhelming. He chewed slowly, eyes wide, and then something cracked inside him. A sound escaped his throat, part laugh, part sob. He couldn't stop himself. The others followed. Within minutes, the hall filled with the sound of chewing, sighs, and quiet disbelief. Some men closed their eyes as they ate, as if afraid the moment would vanish. Others stared at the Coca-Cola bottle in their hands, turning it slowly, watching the bubbles climb to the surface. They had been trained to see the enemy as demons, to believe Americans were incapable of compassion, and yet here they were, being fed like equals. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't home, but it was human, and that, for them, was harder to accept than cruelty. One prisoner whispered to the man beside him, "If they feed us like this, what are we supposed to hate?" The others stared at his tray, unable to answer. The food changed something inside them that no speech could have. The taste of warmth, the proof of humanity. It didn't erase the war, but it cracked the armor of indoctrination that had held them for years. Later that day, when work details began, they moved differently, less rigid, less fearful. The guards noticed it too. The hesitation was gone, replaced by silent confusion. At night, lying on their bunks, the men whispered about the food. Not the portion size or flavor, but the meaning. Why would the enemy show kindness? Was it pity? Was it strategy? Or was it simply who they were? In the darkness, one man murmured, "We were told they had no soul, but I think they do." For the American guards, it was routine another day. another batch of prisoners to feed and manage. But for the Japanese soldiers, that single meal became something much larger. It was the beginning of a slow collapse, not of their bodies, but of their beliefs. The food was more than sustenance. It was a challenge, a message that said, "We can treat you like men, even when you treated us like monsters." Over the following days, the pattern continued. Regular meals, fair treatment, no beatings, no mockery, no revenge. The Americans followed their rules precisely, and the prisoners' men raised to see surrender as shame began to feel something unfamiliar: gratitude. Some tried to hide it, others rejected it outright, refusing to speak or make eye contact. But no one could deny what they had seen. The enemy was not what they'd been told. Days turned into weeks. Small moments began to soften them. A guard returning a dropped glove. A medic asking, "Are you all right?" Even a joke, awkward but genuine, shared through broken English. The cracks widened. Hate, once absolute, began to fade. Many of them started to write letters home, carefully worded, always censored. But between the lines, one truth appeared again and again. The Americans do not treat us as animals. In a war defined by brutality, that single fact carried power. What none of them knew yet was that their treatment at Camp McCoy would ripple far beyond the barbed wire, changing not just how they saw their captors, but how Japan would one day rebuild its relationship with the United States. But that came later. For now, in that frozen Wisconsin winter, the greatest weapon the Americans used was not the rifle or the bomb, but kindness served on a plate. Weeks turned into months. The snow around Camp McCoy melted, giving way to green grass and soft wind. Spring arrived quietly, and with it came a strange sense of calm. The war was still raging somewhere far away, but inside the fences, life had fallen into rhythm. The prisoners worked, ate, rested. They built roads, repaired tools, chopped wood. The same men who once swore they would rather die than surrender were now waking up to the sound of an American bugle, lining up for breakfast and sharing food with guards who, not long ago, were their sworn enemies. At first, they performed each task with stiffness, because obedience was easier than understanding. But over time, something shifted. The fear faded, the hostility softened, and the humanity between captor and captive began to grow. The Americans were still soldiers, strict, disciplined, watchful, but they were also fair. They joked, they offered cigarettes, they treated wounds, and most of all, they treated these men not as monsters, but as men. For the Japanese prisoners, this was the hardest lesson of all. Their leaders had taught them that honor came only through death. That surrender was humiliation. But in Camp McCoy, they saw another kind of honor, one built on respect, on mercy, on discipline, without cruelty. It changed them. One evening, a group of prisoners stood by the fence, watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and red. One of them, a former sergeant, spoke quietly. "I thought surrender would make me less of a man," he said. "But here, I have learned how to be one." Others nodded silently. No one had the words to describe the contradiction in their hearts. They were enemies of America, And yet, America had treated them better than their own army ever had. Letters home carried hints of this awakening. They wrote of good food, medical care, fair treatment. But between the lines was something deeper, a kind of confusion that bordered on awe. They began to wonder what else they had been wrong about the war, about the world, about what it meant to be human. When the war finally ended in 1945, news reached Camp McCoy slowly, almost gently. There was no celebration, no shouting, no anger, just silence. Some cried not for defeat, but because the purpose that once defined them was gone. They were no longer soldiers, no longer prisoners, just men, waiting to go home to a country they barely recognized. Before they left, the Americans gathered them for a final assembly. An officer stepped forward and spoke through an interpreter. "You are going home," he said. "The war is over, but remember what you have seen here. Remember that mercy is not weakness. It is strength." The words struck deep. Many of them bowed, not from command, but from genuine respect. When the ships finally carried them back across the Pacific, they took more than their belongings. They carried memories of hamburgers and Coca-Cola, of laughter through broken language, of compassion that survived the war. In post-war Japan, some of these men became teachers. Others became leaders in their communities. A few even worked with Americans again, helping rebuild the bond between two nations once at war. And when they spoke of their captivity, they did not speak of suffering. They spoke of kindness. One former prisoner later wrote in his diary, "At Camp McCoy, I met the real America. They defeated us with strength, but they won us with decency." The story of Camp McCoy is more than a wartime anecdote. It's a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity can survive the war machine. The Americans didn't just capture soldiers. They captured hearts, not with fear, but with food, with fairness, with the simple, disarming act of treating an enemy as a human being. And sometimes that kind of victory lasts far longer than any battle ever could.